Good.
Good. Everybody hear me okay? My students know that when I get excited, I yell a lot, and sometimes I also curse. So I'm going to try to do neither of those today. But I will get excited. So, let's see here. A few weeks ago, I was in my office, and the door happened to be closed. And the flyers for this event were set up in the hallway. The committee members did a good job making flyers. They put my nice face on it. And somebody walked past my office, and I saw the flyers, and they said out loud, "What about white people?" And the tone was peculiar to me. It wasn't a positive or negative tone. It was just kind of interesting. And I wondered if the title of the talk was something like project-based learning, if that same tone would have happened. Project-based learning! But I didn't think it would have gotten that same tone. And then a week ago, I went to somebody's office here on campus for something unrelated to this lecture. It's a person I run into a lot. I enjoy running into the person. The person's good at their job, happens to be white. And before I could even say one word why I was in the person's office, the person kind of leaped out ahead of me because they had just seen the flyer. And they said, "White people, well, I know everything I've gotten in my life is because I'm white. And I'm just a horrible person because of it." And I wasn't quite sure what to make of it because I was really taken aback by the comment. And I wasn't sure if it was sarcasm, antagonism, a joke, guilt, satire. I wasn't really sure what to make of the response. But it reminded me of what a peculiar topic this is to some people. And I think these reactions are because this is a shadow topic. And what I mean by that is that this topic exists in the shadows. We know it's there. We obviously know white people exist, right? We know it's there, but we seldom talk about it directly. We get glimpses of it now and then, but we rarely take it out of the shadows, put it on stage, put the spotlight on it, and see what we see, like we're doing today. And there are reasons why this is a shadow topic and why it isn't talked about very much. A topic like this disrupts the racial equilibrium that many of us white folks experience. This is what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility. A very useful concept that's been around in the scholarly community since 2011, but just kind of now is starting to bubble up to the surface and gets caught in the algorithm of social media, and we're starting to see it pop up. DiAngelo talks about this concept of white fragility, okay? And she says, white fragility in North America, or white people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what I refer to as white fragility. So she talks about how this protection and insulation happens due to a number of factors, like racial segregation, the sense of racial belonging, psychic freedom, and other factors, and she calls these protective pillows. Okay, so as an example, we see up here a map of racial segregation in our area in southeastern Michigan. Right, so we see up here, what street is this?
8 Mile.
Okay, so we got 8 Mile right here, so Detroit down here, follow Gratiot up here, Woodward's probably about here, we get to Pontiac right about here. Where are we? Oakland? Probably right about here?
Yeah.
All right, so you see in this racial segregation map, red represents white folks, blue represents African Americans, yellow down here represents Latinos and Latinas. This is southeast or southwest Mexican town. So we live in a highly racially segregated environment, and economic segregation very much maps out in the same way. And you could even just take a walk around campus, right? If you're a white person, you can walk around campus and you see other white folks, and you don't see these other white folks and feel like, wow, I just feel like I belong around these other white people, right? You don't feel that, but you experience sameness. You experience being in place, which is very different from if you walk around campus, perhaps, and you are not a white-looking person. So, racial comfort. And the few times we white folks are very conscious of whiteness, when it becomes very salient to us, perhaps if you've ever visited a black church, or maybe you go down to Detroit and it's not a Tigers game happening, those experiences are typically temporary, by choice, or easily avoidable, okay? This is very different from the racial reality of many folks of color, right? A couple months ago, there was a little story in the news about a guy, an African-American guy, who was walking on Perry in Pontiac, not far from where I live. And it was cold outside, kind of like it's been cold out this whole week. And it was cold out, so he has jacket on, his hands in his pockets, and he was pulled over. And that's just like, he was pulled over walking, so I want you to think about that for a second. He was walking, he was pulled over. He was pulled over, and the officer stopped him, and the gentleman videotaped it, you can watch it online, and he said the officer stopped him because he looked suspicious because his hands were in his pockets. Okay? So, racial disequilibrium. Now I walk around in Pontiac all the time because that's where I live, and when it's cold out, my hands are in my pockets, and I can tell you I haven't been pulled over. So, experiencing sameness, racial comfort or discomfort. And D'Angelo talks about what are some of the effects of white fragility. So she says white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of stress, of racial stress, becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. So these emotions and behaviors that she talks about, anger, fear, guilt, and I would add sadness, annoyance, and frustration. Behaviors, argumentation, silence, leaving the stress-inducing situation, right? I'm grabbing some cookies and I'm leaving, you're out of here. And I would add disengagement and resistance. This topic gets particular responses, the kinds of responses I talked about before, because it creates racial disequilibrium among white people. White folks are used to not feeling like we have a race. The thinking goes that race is something that black people have. Asian folks have a race. Latinos and Latinas have a race. White people, well, they're just people. The thinking usually goes along those lines. To have a lecture about the social process that white-looking people experience is to disrupt that equilibrium and to disrupt that comfort. It is to take away one of the protective pillows, and that is why I got the interesting responses I did leading up to this lecture. Matter of fact, I was walking earlier before this out the hall. There were some students sitting at a table, and one of them said, "What about white people?" Because he had just seen the flyer. And I have to say that oftentimes when scholars of color give a talk like this, or they do this type of scholarship, they get incredible backlash. They are bullied in their departments. Faculty members and students complain about them. They get bad teaching reviews, and they're put through horrible emotional turmoil because a topic like this disrupts racial equilibrium. It is true. You can read about the scholarship on that. You can read the chronicle about that. It's highly documented. And I would be remiss not to note this up front, because my thinking on this topic has been informed by a lot of the work from scholars of color who have been bullied and brought through the ringer because of this, because it disrupts racial equilibrium of white folks. So in direct and indirect ways, a lot of the things I'll say today are informed by those risks that other folks have taken. So these points about white fragility are important to note up front, because folks in the audience might react with some of these different emotions or behaviors during this talk. Some folks might get angry. "We're talking about this again?" In response to this anger, they might find themselves listening with a primary objective to hear me say something that's wrong, right? That's not true of all white people. Some folks might experience the lecture in that way, and that's fine. Then might come argumentation, silence, or something else. Or, probably more likely, some people might feel guilty, right? Some people might feel guilty. Guilty because they know what's happening in the world isn't quite right. They feel it's not exactly their fault, yet they can't really wash their hands of it. So they don't know what to do. It's too big, it's too ugly. Paralysis. In my experience, talking about race and equity and social justice with white folks, such as myself, many people experience guilt. And I want to say from the outset that guilt is not a goal and it's not an ending place. It's real, and for some people there's a process to work through that guilt, and it puts them towards a meaningful action. And self-love is also a really important thing for white folks. White people need to love themselves and have good reasons to love themselves. So as we're in this room over the next hour or so, I want to invite you to pay attention not just to what I say. Obviously, I'd like you to pay attention to what I say. But also pay attention to your reactions to what I say. Your emotions and your behaviors as I progress. And to think about why you're reacting as such. For some people, this very lecture is an exercise in building racial stamina. Knowing this resistance that this topic sometimes receives, that's why I said no twice to giving the lecture. So Dr. Francis asked me twice and I said no, and finally he wore me down and I said yes. But ultimately I said yes because there's no systemic social problem that gets solved by us ignoring it. Hungry people don't get fed by us looking the other way, okay? People without homes don't get housing if we ignore them. And children without caretakers don't end up in loving homes by us forgetting about them. And we do not create a more just society along racial lines by turning our backs on what has happened and is happening in the world today. Additionally, there's no societal problem of a systemic origin that is easily solved without the cooperation of the folks who have the most power in the situation. It is not the duty of women to end systems and acts of violence against them. Naturally, many women commit their lives to doing just that. But that is a fight that male-identified people must also wage. It is not the duty of gay, queer, and trans folks to end the systems and acts of violence against them. Here I'm thinking about Indiana. Okay, thinking about Indiana right now. I'm not thinking about the Final Four either. Naturally, many commit their lives to doing just that, but that is a fight straight heterosexual people must also take up. It is not the job of folks of color to end systems of oppression and violence. Of course, they have led that fight. It only makes sense. But this is also a fight, and I would say primarily, the duty of white folks. And so, I said yes to giving the lecture. And since Dr. Francis asked me to give the lecture, if there's anything I say you don't like, you want to complain about, you can email him directly. And his email's right there. A.K. Francis at Oakland IDDU, and he would be glad to respond to any of your concerns. Conversations like this are messy, they don't have neat endings. And as I often say in class, my students here know, I often say that every ending is also a beginning. So I hope to address this topic in a way that isn't so much an ending, but is a beginning. And I also hope to do it in a way that is forcefully appropriate for the seriousness of this topic. So, what about white people? I want to make clear from the start what I mean by white people, and illustrate it by telling you the start of a story. So every St. Patrick's Day, my grandmother still sends me $5 in the mail. Okay? Without fail, $5 in the mail on St. Patrick's Day. And when I get it, I walk around, and I feel a little bit more Irish, right? Even though I always forget to wear greet on St. Patrick's Day, I walk around, I feel a little bit more Irish with that $5 in my pocket, and I try to go find something I can buy for $5, but you can't afford much for $5, right? I have to take a gas. But no matter how I feel when I walk around with the $5 in my pocket, when I walk around, I experience the world in a certain way that I cannot detect unless it's pointed out to me. This process has many parts to it. I'm seen first as an individual rather than as a member of a racial group. I experience racial sameness for the most part when I'm at places that matter. Places that matter such as a board meeting, a faculty meeting, if I'm down at a school district, if I'm in a school, when I'm in spaces of power, I experience racial sameness. People accept my authority unless I give them a pretty good reason not to. And if something bad happens to me, for the most part, the institutions of society that are there to take care of me, police, law enforcement, courts, hospitals, they do what they should, and they've got my back. I experience whiteness. And this experience has little to do with biology. We know from genetics that there's as much human variation within a racial category as there is across racial categories. So if you look around the room real quick. All right, so you see somebody who you think looks like you, all right? You think they check the same box on the census as you do. You see somebody who might check a different box. You have as much in common with both of those people as you do different. So we're very similar genetically, as much genetic variation within a racial category as there is across a racial category. The few differences you have genetically happen to be very visible. Skin color, eye shape, hair texture, and they're a product of human migration patterns, as well as how the body quite amazingly evolves in these new places. Or sometimes it's a product of mutations. I read once that people with blue eyes are a mutation. I have blue eyes, and I think that's kind of cool, because that means I'm kind of like an X-Man, you know, like a mutant. Maybe I could be in, you know, one of the movies, but maybe not. These genetic differences are very superficial. But our history, systems of knowledge, organizations of society, etc., 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 have attached incredible significance and meaning to these differences and built policies, laws, norms, and institutions around them. The structure benefits white folks at the cost of harming folks of color. You can look no further than the housing and economic map I put up here before. This wasn't done by just like randomly everybody moving to be around people who looked like them, right? This wasn't a random occurrence. This was done by policies like redlining, rooted in observable differences associated with what we call race. Policies that benefited white-looking people at the cost of black and brown-looking people. This is an example of what we call white supremacy. Now, I gotta hit the brakes here, because this is the point at which I could start to lose you, okay? I could lose you. Mentioning white supremacy can be kind of a stumbling block for a lot of people, so I want to be really clear what I mean here. When I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about the Ku Klux Klan, white sheets and crosses burning on front lawns. And those are probably the initial things that come to mind when I say that, right? By white supremacy, I'm talking about a system that is largely invisible in mechanisms, but that has scaffolded the world of yesterday and today. White supremacy is built around whiteness. The experience of whiteness isn't identical for everyone. Certainly it's mediated by other aspects of experience, like your socioeconomic status, your gender, your sexual identity, your sexual orientation. Some folks might be thinking that a talk focusing on white people is really presumptuous. I mean, there's like hundreds and millions of white people in the world, right? If you look around this room, there's a lot of white folks in here. At least it appears to me. I don't really know. Maybe we could have a conversation and find out. There's a lot of white people. And I don't even know what many of you had for lunch, right? Let alone where you grew up or how you are. An analogy is helpful here. If I were a medical doctor, I might stand up here and give a lecture about toxins. Toxins in the environment, in the food, toxins all around us. And I would talk to you about a couple things. Pesticides on your fruits and veggies, chemicals in your water, pollutants in the air. I'd definitely talk about meat in the United States. We might even talk about GMOs. And I wouldn't have to know what you ate for lunch or exactly what your individual diet is to be able to speak in a relevant way to the topic, because I know that you eat. Everybody with me here? In a similar way, I don't know where most of the white folks in this room live. Who's on your block, who's in your family, what experiences you have. Most of us are strangers, but I do know that you live. And if you are viewed as a white person by society, then you experience whiteness, you're subject to the same social processes that I am. So, after these like 60 or 70 introductory points, to actually begin, I want to talk about bad white people. I want to talk about bad white people. By the term bad white people, I mean this as a category that gets built in our minds, okay? A heuristic. A tool by which we make sense of the world and what happens in it. A heuristic allows us to see and to not see, to associate and disassociate, to put things in the category and to put things out of the category. Bad white people as a category and as a heuristic. So we might think about it like this. If I say the word jock, okay, certain things come to your mind. Some people giggle, are in the room are giggling, okay? If I say the word jock, you might think of maybe the quarterback for your high school football team, all right? Also, certain qualities are associated with that category. Some of these qualities might be athletic, maybe good looking, perhaps arrogant. Heuristics are built from the examples we encounter, and then we use these heuristics to continue making sense of the world, okay? I could say nerd, right? If I say nerd, if you say nerd to me, I think of Screech from Saved by the Bell. Right? One of my favorite shows, any Saved by the Bell fans here, right? It's timeless, it's timeless. So I think of Screech, and I think of, you know, certain qualities like smart or socially awkward, so nerd is a heuristic. It helps us make sense of the world. We come to build the category through our experience with nerd-like people, and then that category helps us to make sense of what we see subsequently in our experience, okay? Many events, news stories, and court cases over the past few years have built the heuristic of bad white people in our minds. Some of these folks are up here. A few weeks ago, we were introduced to a couple new bad white people. Right now, Levy Pettit and Parker Rice fit into the category of bad white people. A few weeks ago, a video surfaced of these two fellas who were students at the University of Oklahoma in a fraternity, Sigma Alpha Epsilon, singing and leading a song taught to them and passed down within their fraternity. How many people are following me here? Okay. So, so you know these bad white people, all right? And I'm actually going to play the video for you. All right, I'm actually going to play the video for you so you can see it. People's playing it, yeah. That's it. So, short clip caught on a cell phone. Right. You can see the lyrics to what they're singing up here. SA being the fraternity initials. So, and you can see from the video we watched, from the frames, that this took place during an occasion of celebration. Okay? An occasion of celebration. They're on their way to a black tie event, with guys dressed to the nines in tuxedos and women dressed formally as well. We see smiles, enthusiasm, some cheering, a little bit of fist bumping, cameras out, and drinks. Folks are letting loose. When this video surfaced, it blew up on social media, which is why most folks raised their hand here when I said who was seen it. Front page of many major news outlets and in the media cycle, with reactions from other students at the university, parents, family members, eventually apologies from Levi and from Parker themselves. They became a spectacle of bad white people. All right, and you know I have to draw this point out too, that you know if you look at historical photographs of lynchings, okay, if you look at historical photographs of lynchings, what you see is also times of celebration. Lynchings were oftentimes advertised in newspapers as community social events. People dressed up nice, they put on their Sunday best, men and women went together, and sometimes they brought the children along. And the reason why we have photographs of lynchings is because photographers came and took photos of them. White folks lined up in front of the charred, mutilated, dead bodies. They took photos, and afterwards, when those photos were developed, they could purchase them, and they could send them out as postcards. So there's this very important parallel to see between this time of celebration and rallying around whiteness, talking about lynchings, and the actual lynchings that happened, and in some cases continue to happen in this country. And I would be remiss to not step away from my written draft that I'm speaking from and not point that out. And if that's new information to you, then you should put it upon yourself to look up these photos. There's photography books that have been published all about this. This is part of American history. Over the past few years, we've also come to know George Zimmerman as a bad white person. We were first introduced to Zimmerman, see the many faces of George Zimmerman up here. We were first introduced to him in 2012 as the self-appointed neighborhood watch captain, a vigilante of sorts, who saw 17-year-old Trayvon Martin walking home from the store and thought he looked shady. So Zimmerman calls the police and he says, this guy looks like he's up to no good. He's probably on drugs or something. And he follows Trayvon against the direction of the dispatcher. And Zimmerman says to himself under his breath on the phone, these assholes always get away. And a few moments later, a scuffle ensues, and he presses his gun up to Trayvon's chest, and he pulls the trigger and ends his life. And since that night, we've gotten to know a lot of George Zimmerman, both in the coverage of the trial and with his arrests and shenanigans afterwards. He's been behaving very badly. It's kind of hard to keep up with him. Last time I checked, he had been 3 arrests for assault, domestic violence, 1 road rage incident. Of course, everybody drops the charges. The road rage incident, he was quoted as saying, do you know who I am? I'll fucking kill you. He has become an archetypal bad white person. And with this heuristic, this category of bad white people, there are certain behaviors that we come to associate with bad white people. They are bad white behaviors. So, bad white people use the N-word and they sing songs about hanging black folks from trees, like Levi Pettit and Parker Rice. Bad white people chase down unarmed black youth and shoot them dead, like George Zimmerman. Bad white people don't like Muslims, and they kill them execution style over parking space disputes, like Craig Hicks did in North Carolina not too long ago. Judea Barakat, Yusur Muhammad Abu Saha, and Razan Muhammad Abu Saha. Other bad white people fire shots into the cars of African-American teenagers next to them at the minibar, like Michael Dunn did, killing Jordan Davis because his music was too loud. And yet other bad white people kill black folks when they need help, like Theodore Wafer, not too far from here, in Dearborn Heights, who shot Renisha McBride in the face and killed her as she pounded on his door after getting into a car accident outside, nearby. Some bad white people become police officers to join and join professions that require them to carry deadly weapons, like John Rogers and Andrew Hutchins in Dallas, who last summer shot mentally ill Jason Harrison at least 5 times, killing him, as he held a screwdriver in the doorway of his mother's house after she called the police for help to take him to the hospital because he was having a manic episode. Others, like Daniel Pantaleo, don't use guns, killing Eric Gardner with a chokehold. And we could talk about bad white people all day long. And I mean this literally. If you haven't seen this report called Operation Ghetto Storm, you should check it out. It came out in 2012, and it is a report, a 1-year report about the extrajudicial killings of black men, women, and children. And in 1 year, there were 313 killings. That means 1 every 28 hours. Done not just by police, neighborhood vigilantes, security guards, and other self-appointed enforcers. Many of the folks who were killed were unarmed, though not all of them. And this details all of those cases. It is free to download online. If you haven't, you should check it out. Do you know any bad white people personally? Do you? Do you know any bad white people personally? I do. None who've killed any people, but ones who have killed people's spirits. Have you seen them in schools, as your colleagues, as your field placement teachers? The ones who punish children of color harsher than the rest, or deprive them of care and the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th chances that they deserve. They start sentences with phrases like, "These kids just don't learn," or "You'll never get them to listen." Do you suspect anyone in your family of being a bad white person? Sometimes I do. My point in talking about the heuristic of bad white people is not somehow to suggest that you are a bad white person. I want to be clear about that. Again, I don't know most of you in the room, and it's also not my point to illustrate to you or persuade you that somehow these actions are ugly, wrong, or just shameful. I think most of us in the room are in agreement with that, but we should be clear and state that some folks look at the situations that have happened that I've referenced up here, and they've gone on record and said that each of those victims deserve exactly what they got, or got exactly what they deserve. So let's be clear that that's out there, but I'm not even going to go there. I'm not even going to privilege that, and let that detract us from a more streamlined discussion. If that's you, if you're here, then we'll go outside afterwards, and I'll tell you why you're wrong. What I'm more interested in is, and want us to think about, is what these bad white people do for the rest of us who are the good white people. What do the bad white people do for the rest of us, the good white people? If bad white people is a category that we use to make sense of the world and our experiences, then so is good white people. Good white people is also a heuristic. It's a category, a thinking tool we use to make sense of the world and ourselves. It allows us to see and to not see, to classify and to unclassify. Just like the category of bad white people, the category of good white people has a set of actions that are indexed within it. Many of these actions are the opposite of what bad white people do. We understand the good because it's not the bad. In this thinking, bad white people don't do the things, good white people don't do the things that bad white people do. Good white people don't use the N-word, and they definitely don't sing songs about hanging black people from trees. Good white people have never killed anyone, let alone unarmed teenagers of color. It goes without saying that good white people today never owned slaves, but from time to time, sometimes they feel the need to reiterate that to us. Good white people try not to stereotype, try not to be prejudiced or biased, but they still lock their doors when they go to Detroit and Pontiac because, it's dangerous there. Good white people remember what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that we should judge others not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Let me say that part again. Good white people remember what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that we should judge others not by the color of their skin, say it with me now if you know it, but by the content of their character. It looks like we have some good white people here today. Excellent. Good white people don't do the kinds of things that bad white people do. Oftentimes, good white people have diverse friend groups. They go on mission trips to countries where folks of color live, or sometimes to Detroit. They volunteer in inter-service professions. Lots of good white people become teachers. They do this because they want to make a difference. They want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. They want to help, and they want to give back. We got movies about good white people. They're good white movies. Like Freedom Riders, The Blind Side, a new one, Black or White. Right? Anybody see that? Okay. And not surprisingly, good white people like good white movies. My guess is that there are a number of good white people here today. Sometimes bad things happen to good white people. If we look at national statistics, most violent crimes against white people are actually committed by other white people. 85% to be precise, according to the last figures. So if you're a white person and you're worried about something bad happening to you, look around the room right now. Look around. Right? If you see anybody who looks like you, statistically speaking, now you know who to watch out for. Right? Watch your back. But it doesn't always work like that. A very good friend of mine, super good friend of mine, one of my best and longest friends, grew up as the only white kid on the block. And it was a rough block. It was rough for everybody. And like some kids when they're growing up, he was bullied and sometimes he was attacked because he stood out. And in that neighborhood, he stood out because he was white. And for some folks, experiences like this stay with them for a long time and they're hard to see past. I used to be a good white person, but I'm not anymore. I turned in my good white person card. Sometimes I relapse into my good white behavior because it's how I was brought up. And with so many good white people around me, sometimes it's hard not to be like them. And of course, like most of you, I don't want to be like those bad white people. But every day, I try not to be a good white person. And for the remainder of this talk, I want to explain why. And I want to try to persuade you not to be a good white person either. And to understand why, I think we have to look more closely at the relationship between good and bad white people. What is the relationship between good and bad white people? A few summers ago, I had a chance to travel to South Africa. This is me in South Africa, in front of Nelson Mandela's house. We commemorate as it. Kitty corner from Desmond Tutu's house. A colleague of mine at a different university works in a program there. Somebody was supposed to go, couldn't go, so I got to go instead. Traveling for free, getting paid to travel, that's the best way to go. And in South Africa, because of the history of apartheid, which only ended in 1994, I experienced being in the midst of a different category of bad white people. In my mind, at least. Every morning, myself and other professors would wake up, we'd travel to the school we'd be teaching, and the school was on break, which is why we could have our classes there, and since it was on break, there was a lot of maintenance being done in the school. There were windows being fixed and walls being painted, and we held our classes there. And the folks who were the workers would have been classified as black or colored during apartheid. They were not white South Africans or Afrikaners who ruled during apartheid. And since apartheid ended only in 1994, these workers were alive and survived it. They were alive during it, just like I was. So I would walk to class every morning and see them, and I knew that there was no way to tell my nationality. There was no way to tell if I was an American, if I was a South African. There was no way to tell if I was an Afrikaner who lived in, benefited from, and helped uphold the apartheid system not too long ago. In my mind, they couldn't tell if I was a good or bad white person. So I say, "Good morning! How you doing? Paint looks good, windows look great." We'd have little conversations, and because I tend to be a friendly person sometimes, and we'd have short conversations, and pretty quickly my speech would mark me as a North American. Maybe from Canada, maybe from the United States, but pretty quickly it was clear that I wasn't a white South African and that I wasn't there during apartheid. That I wasn't sitting next to them in class, silent as they were dragged out by the government. That I didn't watch idly as they got beat in the streets. That my family didn't flee to Australia or Canada when it became clear that apartheid was coming down. By being marked as a North American, by default, I wasn't a bad white person. It wasn't something I was fixated on or thinking about the whole time, but I felt it there, felt it in my mind, and I felt myself maneuvering around it. And I think we do the same kind of maneuvering here in the United States with our own categories of bad and good white people. The thinking goes that I don't do the kinds of things that bad white people do, those types of actions that we talked about, so by default, I must be a good white person. Whew, good, right? I think we do that same maneuvering here. And I want to argue to you that this is not a healthy way to build an identity. This is what I call an existence by negation. I exist because of the things I do not do. It's also a shadow existence. As long as my actions don't put me front and center, as long as they don't draw attention to me, as long as I exist in the shadows, I'm good. This type of existence is not healthy in other domains of our life. If you have a significant other, you don't consider yourself a good partner if you just don't cuss at them and don't cheat on them, right? You're a good partner because of the things you do for them. If you are a parent or a caretaker, you don't define good caretaking by what you don't do. I've never neglected my kids. They're not starving. That doesn't make you a good caretaker. And if you're our student, you're not a good student if you just don't cheat. And I hope that's not news to anybody in here because, you know, the semester's almost over. I want to convince you that building an identity upon what you do not do is not healthy and that it has costs to it. But this is oftentimes how racial identity works for white folks. And there are examples of this throughout history too. When I was a kid growing up, I was very much a late bloomer intellectually, and I like to think I'm still blooming. I seldom, if ever, read for pleasure. You could find me outside rolling around in the mud or playing football or, you know, getting dirty in other ways. And it wasn't really until halfway through college where I encountered readings that really started to wake me up intellectually and spurred my intellectual growth. And one body of writers and thinkers that did was the Transcendentalists through my American Lit classes. Thinkers like Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. These were thinkers who really helped me develop intellectually, academically, when I encountered them. And they were thinkers who grew to be explicitly against American slavery in their public writings and speeches, especially after passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which required folks in the North and free states to help return escaped Africans back to their enslavers in the South. And that just set Emerson and his fellas just set them off. So they laid into the federal government and to the supporters of slavery and to enslavers in the South. And they went so far as to support in word and financially the violent abolitionist movement of John Brown against those bad white people in the South who enslaved Africans. Emerson, Thoreau, and others, they weren't like those bad white people, those other white people. But if we look at what they wrote in their private journals, in their private lives, they never actually believed in the full humanity of Africans, of darker-skinned people, like John Brown did, which is what led him to Harper's Ferry. A historian named David Reynolds writes of this in his biography of John Brown. Emerson wrote in his journal that God had built insurmountable racial barriers by assigning different degrees of intellect to these different races, making it natural that some would lead and some should serve. Emerson, come on. And Thoreau didn't discriminate in his bigotry, but opened it up to all kinds of groups. He wrote, "The history of the white man," he wrote, "is the history of improvement, and that of the red man a history of fixed habits of stagnation. The African will survive, for he is docile and is patiently learning his trade and dancing at his labor. But the Indian does not often dance unless it be the war dance." I want everyone to take your hand right now. We're going to do a collective face palm. Ready? Take your hand, put your palm to your forehead right now. Very good. All right? Somebody needs to tweet that out. So when I first started learning this, first of all, it broke my little heart, you know what I mean? And I learned this well after I studied the Transcendentalists in college, and I wished I could have gone back to those classes because it would have given me a lot to say in class. But it made me think, how did not being like those bad white people in the South disable Emerson, Thoreau, and others from understanding the most basic fact of human equality? What did they miss because, in part, they lived in the shadows, because they lived by negation, because they weren't like those bad white people in the South? How did this keep them from seeing that the cotton in their clothes, the tobacco they smoked, the sugar in their coffee were all the products of human bondage, torture, rape, murder, and other unspeakables about 1,000 miles south? How did they miss this? Or maybe they did see it, but not being like those bad white people kept them from divesting in the spoils of the system. We can understand a lot about the relationship between good and bad white people by looking at how they respond to one another. When Levi Pettit and Parker Rice were outed a couple weeks ago as leading and enthusiastically singing the song on the bus, many good white people rallied around them to defend them. They took the initiative to explain to the rest of us how these boys really were. Levi's parents stepped to the mic and issued an apology that included telling us the following. "He's a good boy, but what we saw in those videos is disgusting. While it may be difficult for those who only know Levi from the video to understand, we know his heart, and he's not a racist. We know his heart." And as reporters do, they asked all kinds of people who might be close to the situation, their perspectives, students, family members, friends. And another friend of Parker Rice, Matthew Lopez, weighed in. He said, "It's not Parker's core personality." And he continued, "Unfortunately, as things are, that might define him for a while, but it does not define him personally, I feel. Parker Rice is a charismatic, good person, with a good soul, and a good spirit, that I feel truly did not believe in or did not truly understand what he was saying. Truly. 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 He's a good person, with a good soul, and a good spirit. He had an inexplicable suspension of reason. It's like he pooped his pants. He just pooped his pants, like it just happened, right? We should forgive him, for he know not what he do." What we have here is otherwise good white people, and folks of color sometimes, rallying around and coming to the rescue of bad white people. They make up terms like core personality, good spirit, good soul, and they appeal to abstract notions like the heart. And this happens in the jury box too. After George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin, one of the jurors, who we know as juror B, 37, the anonymous number she went by, took a number of interviews and was going to cash in by writing a book about her experience in the jury box. And she told Anderson Cooper, "I think George Zimmerman is a man whose heart was in the right place, but just got displaced by the vandalism in the neighborhoods and wanting to catch these people so badly that he went above and beyond what he really should have done. But I think his heart was in the right place. It just went terribly wrong. I think he's guilty of not using good judgment." His heart was in the right place. Things went terribly wrong. If only he would have used better judgment. Responses like this, which we find everywhere, show something that is very important about the relationship between good and bad white people. And it is this. In the context of white supremacy, we would be led to believe that bad white people, deep down inside, are really good white people. Let me say that again. In the context of white supremacy, we would be led to believe that bad white people, deep down inside, are really good white people. They've just made a mistake. They've made an error. They've strayed from the fold. It's not their core personality. It's not their soul. It's not their heart. And how do we know this? Because good white people, like Juror B37 and Mr. and Mrs. Pettit, tell us so. And in this thinking, since at their core they're good white people, they cannot be held accountable for their actions. And society has little duty to undo any damage that they've caused upon other people and communities. Because at the core, they're good white people. And I want to be clear that thinking the best of one's nature and wanting to maintain a positive self-concept is a human characteristic across race, right? Everybody wants to do that. Think of yourself, the last time you offended somebody, right? Last time you said something to a person, you kind of made them mad, and they brought it up to you. How did you respond, right? That's not what I meant. No, I'm great. No, I didn't mean it like that. You took it the wrong way, right? And hopefully you didn't say, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Like, don't say that, right? You misunderstood me. That's not what I meant. And sometimes when it gets serious, we start volunteering all kinds of information in our defense. Like, well, I would never say that, right? Like, black people are my friends, like, I love kittens, like, I listen to Beyonce, right? Like, we volunteer information to try to show and prove why, you know, that's not my core personality, right? That's a human characteristic, right? We all do it. I've done it oftentimes. When I revert back to my good white behavior, I do it the most. But the difference is that these claims about goodness, humanity, and the undeservingness to be a victim, getting the benefit of the doubt, seldom hold up in the most powerful institutions in our society when it comes to people of color. Most of the time, it only really works out that way for white folks. And we see this most clearly with Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old African-American boy who was all alone playing with a pellet gun in the park in Cleveland. Similar to what I used to do when I was a kid with my BB guns and pellet guns. And somebody alerted the police to this a couple months ago, called and said there's a kid in the park with a gun, and the gun is probably a toy. The caller said that twice to dispatch, it's probably a toy. And the officer sped there, popped up on the curb on the grass, and Officer Timothy Lohman, who had been judged emotionally unstable and unfit for duty in his last job as a police officer, before he came to Cleveland and was hired, jumped out of the car and guns down Tamir in 2 seconds. And as he lay there, blood spilling out of his small body, his sister comes running from across the street yelling, "They killed my baby brother." And the other officer tackles her to the ground and pins her down so that she can't help him. And she watches him start to die, and he dies the next day. And in response to the lawsuit that was brought against the city of Cleveland by his family, the city asserted Tamir's death and injuries were directly and proximately caused by his own acts, not this defendant being the city. And his death was caused by the failure to exercise due care and avoid injury. Tamir Rice doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't get the benefit of having a core personality, a good soul, a good heart. According to the city of Cleveland, the state apparatus that is charged with protecting him and upholding his rights, Tamir Rice got himself killed, which is just another way of saying that he deserved to die. This is why I'm no longer a good white person, and why I'm trying to convince you not to be a good white person either. So what's the alternative to being a good white person? It's being a bad white person. And right now some people are confused. Wait, I thought we were supposed to be bad white people, right? And that's not how you spell bad, is that right? And what's that exclamation point doing in the middle, right? This is semantic inversion. Any language scholars here? Okay, so semantic inversion is when a term acquires a new meaning, kind of the opposite of the meaning. And we actually see this through popular culture, black popular culture, right? When Michael Jackson said that he was bad, he didn't mean he was bad, he meant he was bad, right? Go further back, Sweetback's Badass Song, old, crazy movie, go ahead and watch it sometime, it's a classic. And for me, I learned what bad meant from Run DMC. So if you're still kind of not really tracking with me, just go listen to Peter Piper and they'll tell you, you know, not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. Okay. And you know, I almost, you know, when I was putting this talk together, I almost didn't even want to kind of, you know, turn towards the end and talk about kind of, you know, practical steps forward, because it runs the risk of really oversimplifying this topic and runs the risk of oversimplifying what the process for a more equitable and just world is, right? If there was 3 recommendations, I would have typed them out real nice on color paper, put them on everybody's seat, and I would have just came and told you to check it out and left. So, you know, I almost don't even go there because I don't want to oversimplify it. But I will go there kind of practically trying to carve out some new avenues. And for me, these 3 A's, how to be bad, the 3 A's in the middle there are kind of what I want to play off of in terms of, for me, what the alternative to being a good white person is. And the first of these is being accountable. The first A. Intentions do not matter. Okay? Intentions do not matter. What does matter is damage that is inflicted by actions. When we focus on our intentions or those of others, we move the focus away from the victim or the individual who is surviving those acts of violence and to whom the damage was done, and we justify that damage. Focusing on intentions is a way of justifying violence and damage. Intentions do not matter. Damage does. And the question should not be, did the person mean it? What were their intentions? The question should be, what damage was done? What must happen for that damage to be undone, to be fixed, and who is in a position of power and responsible for undoing those damages? And for healing. And this is much easier said than done. When I was putting this talk together, I was reminded of a conversation I had about 5 years ago with a friend of mine when I lived in Philadelphia. African-American girl was a friend of mine. We're still friends today. We were all hanging out, joking like we always did. And I made a joke about the creative language use in black communities. Being a former English teacher and language person I am, kind of my joke is derived from that knowledge. And about a week later, she brought it up to me because she didn't quite know what I meant, what I was saying, and it kind of lingered with her. And she felt some type of way about it. So we had a conversation, and it was all good afterwards, and we're still friends today. But as I was putting this talk together, I couldn't remember what my actual response was in that conversation. So I texted her. I said, hey, you remember that remember a couple years ago when I said something, you brought it to me later, we had a conversation. She said, yeah, I remember. And I said, I'm trying to remember my exact response because I'm thinking about how white folks oftentimes appeal to their intentions first, rather than thinking about the damage certain actions have done regardless of their otherwise good intentions. Did I do that? She said, yeah, you did, LOL. Yeah, you did, LOL. All right, LOL. I said, ha! Dang, I thought so. Well, for what it's worth, I hereby retract said justification of good intentions and re-apologize for what I said. And there's actually more correspondence after this, because she told me how, after this last text, it took her a while to respond. She was probably at work, I know no people here text at work, but we do. And she said, wow, I didn't know that there was still some actually emotional hurt with me from that conversation. And this kind of brought it back up, and we texted back and forth a little bit. And that idea about emotional damage and emotional violence is also so important, because forgetting about intentions also focuses us away from emotional violence. And our heuristic of bad white people so oftentimes operates upon physical violence that it distracts us from the emotional violence that happens as well, is much more prevalent and is equally damaging. Second, I think it's imperative to be explicitly and unapologetically anti-racist. I say this in direct opposition to being colorblind. And this has been written about a lot in education with Beverly Tatum and Gloria Latson-Billings and a lot of scholars, this notion that, we hear this from teachers a lot sometimes, I don't see children, or I don't see colors, I just see children, right? I don't really see race, I just see people. And it's sometimes kind of, propagated as this sort of very, progressive way of approaching the world. And if you think about it, it's very arrogant to decide what part of somebody else you will and will not recognize. Particularly when, as a white person, I will oftentimes not be seen in that type of way. It's a very arrogant thing to say. And I'm not even going to go deep into this because I think we're kind of starting to get this idea in education and social sciences that this colorblind approach is very damaging. So I'm not even going to really go deep there. But so much more is required there. And I follow the principal of the high school I went to on Twitter, and it's not the same principal. He'd be like 150 years old if it was, but the current principal. So I follow him, and last week he sent out a tweet about teachers being non-racist. And I thought to myself, what a low bar that is to set for a profession, to just do no harm. There is no societal problem of a systemic origin that was fixed and healed and remedied because people just stopped being bad. We must be explicitly and unapologetically anti-racist. And this doesn't mean just being nice to people, not stereotyping and not being biased. It means naming the system of white supremacy, dragging it into the light, and exposing it. This is a lifelong process of learning and doing and undoing. It means doing a lot more listening and learning first before talking. And when it comes to talking, it means having more conversations with white folks than it does with folks of color. And you know, as I'm talking this, I'm remembering of an example last summer. I was at a community meeting in Clark Park in Southwest Detroit, part of the Rise Up, and an organizer down there told a story about a gentleman who had just moved into the neighborhood recently, or had moved in a while back. Middle class, young white dude, and moved in there, which is totally fine. Young middle class white, kind of like me, but it wasn't me. So he moves in there and he wants to help out, wants to be part of the solution. So there's a vacant lot right next to his house, so he decides, I'm going to dig it up and I'm going to build a garden, right? Urban gardens, that's kind of fly and sexy now. So he digs it up and he puts a garden in. And lo and behold, he finds out that that was the field that the young kids in the neighborhood used to play soccer. So wanting to be part of the solution and kind of being gung-ho out in front of everybody damaged the neighborhood instead of joining the community. Realizing that if there's a problem, there are already people working on a solution. And you can be a part of that solution, you can play your position as long as you get to know people. And you don't put yourself at the center of the solution or the situation. And I think there's a very important lesson there for white folks who are moved to action and want to be part of the solution. There's a very important lesson there in terms of learning by listening, learning what your position is, and playing your position rather than being at the center of everything. And finally, this means agitating. To be a bad white person means to agitate against white supremacy and people who knowingly and unknowingly uphold it. And this is what I mean. I want every student in here before you go to bed tonight, I want you to pull out a syllabus from the class you had this semester. Pull out the syllabus and look at the readings you've been assigned. Look at all the things you've been reading, or you should have been reading. Look at those, and I want you to see how many of those readings have been written by people of color. You look it up, right? Do it. And if it's entirely or mostly white folks, I want you to think hard about whether you're getting your money's worth for your education. What's tuition up to now? A lot, like too much, right? That's a qualifier I will accept, right? Are you getting your money's worth when you look at the racial diversity or lack thereof of which you're learning in classes? And if you grew up in a predominantly white community, went to a predominantly white school and had mostly white teachers, if you describe yourself as somewhat racially sheltered, wouldn't it make sense that a very important part of your education at this fine institution would be to help you get what you have missed? I know that's exactly what happens in a lot of classes here. But is it what you're getting? And if it's not, what will you do? Because open mouths get fed. So will you email your professor and ask, quote, I'm curious why we're reading mostly white writers or scholars. Is it possible for us to be exposed to a more racially diverse set of material? Will you send that email? And don't take, we have a diversity class you could take, as an excuse. Because that's oftentimes the excuse for everybody who does not teach that class to not to have to worry about it. When your classmates come back from field experiences, or from wherever, and you say, how was it? And they say, it was good, but the neighborhood was kind of sketchy. Or it was a little shady. Or it was all right, but the kids are great, but they're kind of different. Will you say, how do you think your beliefs and perspectives have been shaped by your experiences as a white person? Will you say that? Now make sure the person's white. Because it's not, you got to have conversations, so it's not always, you can't always tell, right? And this is something interesting about, how genetics and race work and what we think is, classification and not. Will you ask that question? How do you think your beliefs and perspectives have been shaped by your experiences as a white person? Will you ask somebody else that question? Will you make whiteness visible? Because that is exactly what a question like that does. And if you're a professor, pick up the syllabus from your own class that you're teaching this semester. and look at the same thing. Or better yet, look at the reference list from the last article you wrote. Does your syllabus suggest that people of color have contributed little or nothing to the topic that you are teaching, or the subject of your course? It's not your intention, of course it wouldn't be your intention, but intentions don't matter. What's the outcome? And in response to this question, a lot of professors say their training or expertise is very narrow, and therefore it's not really their fault if their syllabus is mostly white, or so on and so forth. But I don't buy that. I cannot believe that people who hold the highest degree awarded by the Western system of education cannot learn or locate material that is equitable, diverse, and representative. It's not a matter of ability, it's a matter of will. And, a racially diverse reading list is like day one stuff. Bare bones, 101. And with how long I've been talking, I don't really even have time, to go talk about course offerings, program offerings, student life, theoretical frameworks. But I think you get where I'm going with this, don't you? Do you get where I'm going? Okay? And we need to be very clear that there are costs to agitating, because in those very moments, you're making whiteness visible. You are no longer in solidarity with it through your silence. You are identifying and working against a system that goes largely unseen and unobstructed. If you weren't, there would be no resistance to your actions. There would be no funny looks, there would be no pushback, there would be no breaking of racial equilibrium. But by those actions, what you do is you take a small step, perhaps the first of many steps, out of the shadows, and you take the side of human freedom, like so many other people before you. Many people who are actually in this room, who live in Ferndale, who live in Bloomfield Hills, who live in Rochester Hills. People who have already done that. And that is a reason to love yourself as a white person. Thank you and good afternoon.